Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Zone to Speak podcast. I'm your host, Juliana. This episode of Zone to Speak is supported by Peloton, the ultimate sunscreen for athletes. If you know me, you know I never leave the house without sunscreen, and Peloton is my go-to. It's lightweight, breathable, and designed for endurance sports, perfect for any day out on the saddle. And because they are supporting the podcast, you get 20% off your order. Just head to the link in the show notes and use the code ZONE2SPEAK at checkout. Protect your skin, fuel your adventures, and support the pod while you do it. All right, welcome back to Zone to Speak. A while ago, I spoke with Erik deBrun to talk about engineering, comfort, and why cyclists have spent decades believing suffering was somehow part of the sport. Today's episode is a little different because after that conversation, I realized something. A lot of us know Redshift. We have seen ShockStop stem. We have heard people rave about the seatpost. Maybe we have spotted one on a bike or on an ultra setup. But if someone asked us, okay, what does it actually do? Most of us would probably answer, well, it makes your bike more comfortable, which is true, but there's a lot more going on than that. So today, Erik is back to break it all down in plain English. How do these products work? Do they make you slower? Do they make you faster? What surprises people after trying them? So let's get into it. Erik, welcome back to Zone to Speak.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. So last time you were here, we talked about the philosophy behind Redshift. Today, I would love to make this more practical. If someone has never heard of Redshift before, what would you tell them in 30 seconds?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that we make components, touch points on the bike, and our main goal is to solve some of the problems that plague your average cyclist and elite cyclists, as well. Whereas maybe other brands might focus on specifics like weight or speed. We sort of come at it from the biomechanical side of things. How do we make your body sort of function as best as it can on the bike?
Awesome. All right. If people know Redshift, it's usually because of the ShockStop stem. Why do you think the product resonated so much?
I think because it started a conversation that's obviously gone much further than just that stem itself. But, if we go back to 2015, 2016, the way that I think we approached your sort of, performance riding, I think anyone who's an enthusiast, anyone that's going out there to do, exercise on their bike, serious riding, all the way through serious racing, I think that group of people, they saw sort of a top-down approach. So, bike manufacturers, component manufacturers, their focus was how do we make stuff that works for the elite group? And then we say, look, this works for elite riders. This is going to be good for everybody else. And I think products that were geared towards what you might consider the larger group of riders, not necessarily starting with elites. I think some of those were viewed as pretty cheesy, actually. And I think that the ShockStop stem started a conversation probably around the idea that, well, what if you do make something that is actually more important to your largest group of riders, still important to elite riders, but actually less important to them? And then what does that actually do? And I think it flips things a little bit because, you're as the sort of larger group of riders, we're willing to make certain trade-offs that say an elite rider wouldn't want to make. And so maybe I'm willing to add a little bit of weight to my bike, and I'm talking a little bit of weight, to get something significant out of that. So that's I think the trade-off we presented to people, which was, here, take off your existing stem, put this stem on, add 100 grams to your bike. But all of a sudden, you're going to be riding around your city, your town, your local streets, and you're going to feel the bumps and the vibrations a lot less than you were. You won't be disconnected from the road, but all of a sudden, it's going to smooth things out. So your ride is going to be a little bit more fun. And then the side effects are you're going to have, significantly less fatigue. You're actually going to have a lot less compounding, type of, body disturbances that lead to long-term injuries. And you're going to be a little bit faster. You're going to go ride a little bit longer. You're going to recover quicker. And I think for your more nominal group of riders, this is a really big impact, like riding the next day or going an extra 2 hours, or feeling nothing on the ride. Whereas your elite rider, they're training all the time. Their bodies are at, the peak physical condition. This just isn't as much of a benefit necessarily to them. So I think that it was polarizing because we were coming at it from a different angle. And the other side I think that people might remember is that this was before Specialized had come out with the Future Shock. This was before people were putting forks on gravel bikes. This is before all of that type of stuff. So I think adding suspension to a road and sort of an early gravel bike was unique and different. And we were kind of alone for a couple of years doing it. And so we were out there saying, hey, these things are important. I think when some of this other stuff starts to come in, people now, they think, oh, yeah, of course, everyone realizes that compliance on the bike is a good idea. But at the time, I think it was like bikes are super stiff and we're introducing compliance to the bike. And that was a very different thing that anyone, I think, had really sort of proposed at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of riders hear suspension stem and immediately imagine a mountain bike suspension. And when you talked about putting a suspension fork on a gravel bike, I always think like, well, why don't you just get a mountain bike, right? And what I like about Redshift is that you can still have a lot of comfort without transforming your gravel bike in almost on a mountain bike. Would you explain the ShockStop stem to someone who has never seen it?
Sure. Yeah. It's fairly simple, actually. And I'm glad you mentioned, so back in the early 90s, there were a couple suspension stems that were introduced. And for anyone that doesn't remember that time, these stems came before front shocks existed. So the mountain bikes were all rigid. And then two different people came up with these suspension stems. They had a lot of travel. So they're a very different animal than the ones that, that we and others make today. And these were literally introduced for racing. And there were a couple years where they were the thing you had on if you were at the top of the elite racing group. People won World Cups on them. It was a very, very, very serious, sort of like elite type of thing. And then a fork was introduced instantly. It was better suited. It was a superior technology. And quickly the suspension stem for mountain biking became kind of a thing that was there and then it went away.
Yeah.
We were aware of this concept. And again, they're fairly simple. And so when we revived that concept to sort of solve this need that we found with the super stiff bike, that was leading to these sort of long-term biomechanical type issues and short-term, on the bike discomfort, we examined what had been done. And the one that we replicated, because it was the simplest, was just a stem with a single pivot point close to the steerer tube. So you can imagine a stem that's just in two pieces, a piece that clamps to the steerer tube, and then another piece that clamps to that piece through a pivot point. And inside the stem, the way that we do it is we have some elastomer, I'll call them little pucks. And those go inside the stem and they just get compressed. And so at its core, it's very simple. Your handlebar can move independent of the steerer tube about 20 millimeters or so. Generally, that travel is much less than that. So it's not like you feel your handlebar moving. You just feel the compliance. So it's a compliance. It's not like when we talk about suspension, a lot of people might think about like moving through inches of travel. It's nothing like that. We're talking about very slight movement, a few degrees of movement of the handlebar. And that's why it's okay to have a single pivot, because you're not actually changing the position of the front end of the bike. It doesn't actually change your fit in any meaningful way. Most of the time, everything is stable the way you expect it to be. And so, it sounds very simple. It is very simple. The complicated bit comes in order to make that stem feel rigid, like a regular rigid stem. And, as soon as you add pivot points into things, your brain instantly thinks, it's going to be this sloppy thing moving all over. And that was the real sort of challenge for us, was how do we engineer something that is completely rigid and only compliant in the vertical direction? And then how do you actually get that feeling to work right? And so where we put our energies was into the pivot point. And we did some pretty interesting things there in order to make it rigid. And then in the elastomers inside the stem, we did a lot of work on how elastomers are very interesting. They're like a spring, but they're different. They have a lot of interesting properties. And, if you think about just their slugs of rubber, right? When you squeeze them, they expand in other directions. And so we were able to take advantage of that and use the geometry inside the stem to create a very interesting sort of feel as you compress. And so ultimately, what you get out of it after all of this iteration we did is you don't feel like a normal spring where you're bouncing on the spring. You get a very, very nice, sort of movement towards an endpoint that doesn't feel like an endpoint, and then recovery back to a neutral point, and then it stops. So there's no bouncing around. And that's the benefit of having an elastomer and kind of constraining it in certain ways. So ultimately what that means is a rider going down the road, stem feels completely rigid all the time. They don't notice it. You hit a small bump or, a little bit of roughness in the road, and you'll get this, and, the stem will move a little bit and then just come right back to the center, kind of like almost one period of movement. So what happens is you get a little bit of movement when you're encountering a bump. If you had a rigid stem, you would be bumped off the bike in that situation. And so instead of you getting bumped off the bike, the handlebar moves a little bit and it slows down the impact coming to the body. And by slowing it down, it makes it completely different. It takes all of the energy and spreads it out so that your body can absorb it in a way that isn't as jarring as it would be otherwise. It's not like we're taking that energy and sending it somewhere else. It's just slowing the energy down. And that's really the key.
And can this rigid piece be adjusted? Like if I want it just to be rigid all the time, the stem for some reason, or if I wanted more movement, can that be adjusted?
Absolutely. And we're really big on one size does not fit all. So I think if people know our products or they look at them, they'll notice that we provide a lot of different sizes of things. So in our stem, we have stems that range from 55 millimeters to 120. And we really don't like to put people into something that is not necessarily for them. So, we offer this really wide range of sizes. We offer the adjustability as well with all of our stuff. And I think that that's really kind of a key thing. So the stem actually comes with 5 different elastomers, and you can put in different combinations. So you can use a single one if you have a flat bar, and you can go all the way to 2 very, very stiff elastomers. So you can set the stem up such that it essentially doesn't move. And the only thing that it does is absorb these sort of high frequency vibrations. Interestingly enough, that's actually a really, really important thing to do. So just absorbing high frequency vibrations, that is something that's quite damaging to us as we ride. It's a compounding type of thing that is not great. It's like if you picture yourself standing on something that's just vibrating all the time, that's not like a great thing to be in. And that's what the bike is like. It vibrates all the time. So getting rid of that high frequency is one of the sort of most important things.
Amazing.
Yeah. So you can get the stem really stiff such that you don't feel anything, and it's still absorbing some of this high frequency, which again is pretty critical. I think today, even when we were doing that work, we didn't realize how impactful some of that stuff was. And I think the more that we've gotten into this sort of space, the more we've talked to fitters and folks that do, biomechanical work, and how much vibrations coming into the body can actually, really, really affect us over time and create kind of these wrist injuries, the type of things, you get from, say, typing on a keyboard or sitting at a desk. That can be really compounded, when you're on a bike, just getting that going into your hands all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The stem gets a lot of attention. It is an amazing product. The seat post maybe doesn't get enough attention. So let's talk a little bit about that. How does the ShockStop seat post work differently, and who should be buying one?
That's a great question. And so when we put the stem out there, the obvious question was, you guys should do a suspension seat post. And we had always had that in mind. There were existing suspension seat posts, and they had kind of stood the test of time a little bit. People will remember the Thud Buster was, introduced for mountain bikes a long time ago. Very, very good technology. I think it's been really useful for people over the years. And so there were a few suspension seat posts. And our sort of point where we felt like there wasn't a solution was something that was really compact, that had a sort of the proper kinematics or more optimized kinematics, and what I can sort of consider this idea of like a bottomless type of situation. So I think, when you have a suspension, one of the worst things that can happen is you're constantly hitting off you're bottoming out or you're topping out. And so that was what we really focused on with the seat post. Was we didn't want to create a like one of these old style spring saddles, where you're just bouncing your way all around. So what we really focused on was, how could we make something incredibly compact so that it actually fit well on the bike and didn't look like kind of this crazy thing that you were adding to the bike.
Yeah.
But at the same time, optimize it for what actually happens when your rear wheel hits a bump. And then how do we make it something that can be really tunable, such that when you're riding along is not doing anything unless it needs to. And so the front end of the bike and the rear end of the bike, they're very different actually. On the front end, you really do want this kind of stiff approach to things. And so that's why, our stem, it's on the rigid side, right? It's, there's very little, bounce, very little sort of more periods of movement. On the rear of the bike, we're much more sensitive actually, because there's more of our weight on the rear of the bike. And so interestingly enough, that's why saddles are so important. That sort of connection to the bike at where you are sitting, it's really critical. And so, what actually needs to happen there is a little different. Like you are trying to slow down the impacts, but you're trying to do it in a way that, kind of has this fast reaction, and that's, if you react too slowly at the rear, you still feel kind of quite a bit. And so one of our keys was, how do we react quickly, but still have it be quickly damped out? And so there's two things that go on. One is getting the kinematics set up properly. The other thing is kind of how you design the insides. So there were other products out there, they were good. They had, what we consider to be, some downsides or, some things that weren't optimal. So our entry was really at the performance end of the spectrum. And that doesn't mean that someone who's doing commuting wouldn't really benefit from our seat post. And these days we have a commuter version, that we've made that has some simplified things and has that,
awesome,
wonderful feel. But we kind of came in at that performance end, and it was, really for your enthusiast rider. It's the person that's on the road. It's the person that's on a gravel bike. And it's not trying to be like a rear suspension on a mountain bike. It's trying to do the same thing as the stem. It's taking the sting out of stuff. It's allowing you to stay seated during rough terrain. One of the biggest things I think that you get from adding a little bit of what I would call like micro suspension to the bike is, if you picture yourself, we've all been trained to stand up, kind of like loosen our grip and, stand up and ride through sort of rough terrain and brace ourselves. Well, when you do that, you're loading big muscles in your body. So you're starting to fatigue yourself more, and you're not pedaling at that time, right? So power's gone to zero. So if you can maintain a seated position more often through stuff that you might normally stand up because you don't know what's coming, and you have the confidence to kind of keep the cadence going, kind of keep focusing on the sort of power zone you're operating in, I think that ultimately, even if you put in a little less power, you're still putting in power to the bike. And so you're kind of getting yourself through these zones. So that's one of the biggest impacts that you get from, having, I'd say the seat post maybe even more than the stem, because we stand up because we're going to get thrown off the saddle, if we hit certain bumps. And with the seat post, you can ride through some really rough stuff. Not everything, obviously, but you can ride through some pretty rough stuff where you might not normally want to do that, because it either will hurt a lot or you'll get thrown off a normal bike. And with this amount of suspension, there's 35 millimeters in our standard post. You get that's quite a bit of movement of the rear wheel. It's actually more than 35 millimeters sort of when translated into bumps. So ultimately, I think that's one of the biggest impacts is, yes, it reduces the vibrations. It makes the bike less stiff. It does absolutely allow you to ride faster because you're putting power in. But really that sort of fatigue aspect of not standing up and sitting down and standing up and sitting down, you are sort of sitting, you're more relaxed the whole time. And that pays huge dividends as the ride goes on.
Wow, that's so powerful. Everything you said. I know that when I'm on bikepacking trips or ultra races, I'm always getting up my bike because I always feel like, oh my God, I need to save my ass. So yeah, I really need to try the seat post. I have it on my bike, the stem, and it's amazing, amazing, amazing. But yeah, I think for anyone going through gravel or rougher terrain or long hours on the bike, the seat post also seems like an amazing solution. And who would have thought it's not just comfortable? Because we talked about that on the other episode, that comfort equals maybe more hours on the bike, which, it doesn't mean that you're slower. But now with this explanation that you actually can continue to pedal longer and maybe less fatigue because you're using less of the big muscle group, makes total sense. Amazing.
And I think that, everyone's at different stages of their riding, right? Like we're talking about, there's lots of people that are, they've worked themselves into a point where they can do an ultra race, right? And I mean, I think that's amazing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people that are, enjoying the bike just as much, and they get out there and they ride for half an hour. And so, on both ends, if you can extend that to either riding the next day, feeling fresher the next day, or that half an hour turns into an hour all of a sudden.
Yeah.
That's double the amount of time that person was on the bike. So it's double having fun. It's double the exercise. It's double getting outside and breathing air and being near trees and all that kind of stuff. And if you think about the ultra side, just a small increase in power over a huge day makes a massive difference. And so I think that, and we see this in all the ultra races, there's different setups that are ideal for different types of terrain. And I think that this fits in there where we find that a fair amount of the ultra elite riders, and people doing, their own bike packing, self-supported in their own races and things, I think that on certain types of terrain where you are just cranking out the miles and it's not like some super technical downhill or something, having a suspension seat post, it is the lightest weight thing you can do to actually, gain back all of that fatigue. And we've got a number of elite riders, I think, who swear by it because it really makes a difference for them, I think, both physically and mentally, because they, when you do day after day after day, it does add up. And I think the more you can push that out, the better off you are. I've got a good friend who, he has this great description of ultra racing where he talks about, like, when you start an ultra race, you start with like a glass of water, and you have to be really careful because throughout the race, it gets lower and lower and lower, kind of like to the end. And I always joke that it's like it starts to fill with sand. That's like what's happening. The water's spilling out because it fills with sand. The more you can push that glass out more full for further before you start decreasing it, because there is a point where you just can't, you just need to recover. And so I think that if you can push that fatigue out, you can get your short rest, and it's more reviving. You can get back on the bike and you're not like, oh man, I'm about to sit on here and this is going to be miserable. So I think if you can just push that stuff to the right, your performance is just going to go up and up and up.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes so much sense. And I wonder how it feels to have both the stem and the seat post, which brings me to my next question. A lot of people ask, should I start with the stem? Should I start with the seat post? Should I get both? How do you help riders decide on which one to start first, or if they should get both?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends. I think there are people that it does make sense to get both, because they know that, let's say they're starting to do ultra distance riding or they're doing bike packing. I think that rider, absolutely starting with both makes perfect sense. I think someone that's doing more day type riding or weekend type riding, sometimes it can help to do one and then, add the other. I would say that for different people, one makes a bigger difference. For me, the stem makes a bigger difference. But at the same time, I think if I ride a bike without the seat post, it's incredibly noticeable. So I think you get to this point where once you're used to riding with that kind of thing, it's really hard to not ride with them. Because it's just a completely different feel to the bike. I mean, I often joke around and say that, when you take one of them off, that side of the bike feels like it's made out of like stone, because all of a sudden you feel everything that's coming through the road.
Wow.
So I think it really does depend. I think there are some people that they're looking for something to relieve on the rear of the bike, right? They have this need, and I think there you start with the seat post. I think other people are having they're having hand pain or wrist pain, and it's like, okay, great, like start with the stem. If this relieves it, I mean, maybe you do want to go with more. We've got lots of riders that have one, the other, and both, and I think it is often that someone will start with one and add the other because they do work really well together. And sometimes adding one makes you notice the other side of the bike quite a bit. So I don't think there's really a right answer. I often think that it's sort of, if someone's interested, what's the thing that's maybe more bothersome to them? And then sort of starting there is a good way to do it.
It makes sense that it's up to the individual needs and, pains and complaints.
I wouldn't say that one is more impactful than another. I think if you're doing significant ultra racing, like if an elite rider sends me a note and says, hey, I'm looking for this, I probably would recommend that they start with a seat post, because they're probably going to benefit more over such a significant amount of riding per day by being able to stay seated. And I think that's probably a bigger benefit to their sort of that side of things. But honestly, I think when you start to slide the other direction, it's very even. I think a lot of people fight with their saddle and fight with their seated position a lot. And I think it's a combination of saddle and seat post. I think a lot of people would benefit from a suspension seat post. I think it would make a benefit for almost everyone. But at the same time, I think they should not. They should also look to be doing that saddle search, finding a saddle that really works for you. I think it takes a little bit of time. There is some science behind it. There is some art behind it. And I think when you find that combination, it's amazing. And so, the seat post isn't going to solve saddle, all your saddle woes, but it really does make a difference. And maybe it'll highlight what your true saddle woes are. So I think that's kind of something that someone will get the seat post and they can go through a saddle journey to find kind of what's the right fit. And it's frustrating. I think as someone who, maybe rides occasionally and they start to ride more, we've all experienced this, someone saying, oh, saddles are supposed to hurt and you need to just ride through it. And I think for many people that can actually be true, but that's not true for everyone. So you do have to kind of advocate for yourself when it comes to the saddle. And like, if it's just hurting all the time, it's not the right one and you got to try different stuff. So I'm always a big proponent of bike fit, saddle choice, and then having compliance just makes all of those things, again, it just pushes things to the right. Everything's going to hurt eventually. But if you're only going to ride for 6 hours, if it starts hurting after 10 hours, then great. Like, you've done it.
Exactly. Yeah. I completely agree. I have a friend, he's a bike fitter. He owns a bike shop in Dubai. I think I said this on the podcast before. I don't know if it was with you, but he said something that it's so true. That if you're going to be sitting somewhere for over 10 hours, it could be the softest velvet couch. If you're sitting there in the same position for 10 hours, it's going to hurt. So I think finding comfort and having a nice ride for a long period of time, it is important. But yeah, there's no miracle. I mean, some people are, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but some people have zero issues and it's amazing. Others have. I mean, I sometimes struggle a little bit, but it's just like when I get to like day 3 of 15 to 20 hours riding a day, which is like, okay, normal, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a really good thought, is that eventually if you just ride the bike for a certain period of time, you're gonna encounter the difficulties, right? And they're gonna be all kinds of things. I think what's interesting is those physical difficulties, I think they do become mental difficulties. And so
absolutely
there is an element of that kind of working together to make things worse. And so I think people, we talked about it last time, but I think people sometimes associate the idea of comfort with kind of giving up, or is this, somehow, you're adding comfort to something. It's kind of like a cheating, type of thing. And I, in the softest version of that word. Right. And I think that's sort of like a very, I think that's sort of a silly approach to that idea, because
Yeah.
ultimately, riding a bike is supposed to be enjoyable, even if the joy is coming from challenging ourselves in sort of extreme situations. And so, making yourself set up in the most comfortable way is helpful mentally as well, because your outlook is more positive when it's like that. If you get on the bike and it doesn't feel nice, that's in the back of your mind. And as time goes on, it takes up more and more and more space. So I think even if it was just comfort for comfort's sake, it relieves some of this mental stress, which is really important for everyone that's riding a bike, even if it is for half an hour. I think that everyone's challenge, can take up the same amount of space for them mentally,
Yeah.
and so I think it's like, and I always try to think about that as, that if I try a new sport or something, I don't go out there and do 10 hours of that sport right away. I might do 20
Yeah.
minutes and think, whoa, that was really hard. And so I think about, everyone's at different stages of their riding, and, for everyone that challenge is big. So no matter what we can do to make it more enjoyable mentally, I think that's actually like a really critical thing. Take away all of the, ability to ride faster and less fatiguing and all those other effects that come into play. But just having a more positive outlook is super important.
Yeah. I agree 100%. Yeah. Very good points. Well said. If we shift gears a little bit and talk about how testing happens, how many prototypes a product go through before it reaches the riders?
Yeah, it does vary, but it's probably a lot more than people think. So,
Really?
um, yeah, the seatpost is a good example actually, because we probably spent 2+ years in development on the seatpost.
Wow.
And, part of that time comes from when you're making something. Sometimes you can't actually effectively test something unless you use the real manufacturing method. And so that's one of the challenges sometimes with cycling stuff, is that, there's sort of two things that come into testing. One is the performance side, and then one is the durability, the safety, that kind of thing. And when it comes to the sort of durability and safety side, it is really hard to use prototypes to, kind of determine that you are able to pass those tests. So the bike industry in general has a standard that we use. It's an old standard, but it's still valid today for different types of riding. There's a standard that applies a test that, if you run these tests, the implication is that product will work for the range of riders and it will last for a very long time. And so this is kind of our industry standard for safety. At Redshift, we add a number of tests on top of that. And we also test well beyond those standards, because we feel like, they're good, but it's always good to have factors of safety additionally built in. And then there's certain things that we
Yeah.
think in particular maybe, should be done. So we always go above and kind of beyond. And what happens is you really need to have the final manufacturing technique, because when you go from prototype to manufacturing, it's a pretty significant difference in how things are actually produced. And it has an effect structurally, on things. So what will happen is, you have to accept the fact that you'll go into production, you'll make some samples, and then you may need to adjust things. And so during a development time, we'll do a number of prototypes. And with the CPOs, we probably did, 10 or something, of distinct
Wow.
prototypes along the way, working out the mechanisms, working out the kinematics, figuring out the aesthetics, and then working on the performance, tweaking things to make it feel right. Once you kind of
Right.
have that piece done, then you say, okay, we're ready to transition to manufacturing. We're going to go make what we call tools. The C post, in our case, it's a forged piece of equipment. So the way that it works is it's this big slug of aluminum sitting in kind of a mold, and then they have what they call a mandrel that comes in and pushes through the middle of it and spreads the C post out. So it actually like extrudes it inside this thing, and it's very impressive,
Wow.
to imagine that type of thing taking place. But it is very nuanced as well. So there's a lot of different things about how that's done that can be changed that make a difference. Where the wall thickness is in certain places, how it tapers here, how it tapers there, the thickness of different things. So once we do that, there's still even more iterations that go on that you probably wouldn't call prototyping, but they're sort of like iterations on the design and the engineering. So that one took quite a long time because it has both complicated kinematics, it has complicated mechanism inside. You need to make sure the performance is where you want it to be, and then it has to, be structurally sound and pass all of these tests. And then there's a lot of variation. So, we started with a couple. We now have, I think, maybe 12 or 14 different, seatposts of different sizes and different types. And each one of them has to, meet these. Some of them are bigger and they're designed to carry, like larger riders, like say for e-bikes and stuff. Some are more performance oriented, so they have different sort of standards on top of them. So yeah, so that one took quite a while. Sometimes we have products where we go through a few, iterations and think, wow, this is excellent. One good example is our grips. So we make grips for drop bars, and that was really, really fast on a prototyping standpoint, which was interesting. And part of it was that, it was a very organic type of shape. We actually did, kind of what you might picture in a, like if you're a true designer, we had clay and we were actually molding clay to find out what shapes we wanted. And ultimately we arrived at very quickly a shape that worked pretty well. We prototyped it a little bit and it felt great. And then really the only work was kind of on the material science side, getting something that was stiff enough that you felt like you had a good platform, but had some compliance such that you were actually getting some benefit from a little bit of that. And so there was more of the material science side than actually on the other. So we had sort of a finished thing and just had a few iterations of materials, to do some testing with. But so it goes both ways. I would say, these days we never set artificial deadlines. So we'll start a product, we'll start working on we find that we have this unmet need or something that we've discovered. We think, hey, could we come up with a solution? Start working on something. Maybe we try more than one avenue, and we let it go how it's going to go. So we never say we're going to have this done by this date. And so, so really only until we're sort of like, okay, we're done with the design of this, then we start thinking about what the time frame might be. But we're careful not to sort of constrain ourselves in a way that doesn't let us get to the end. So if we have to keep prototyping, we keep prototyping. There are products that we have not released where we continue to make prototypes over time and revisit them, and they haven't gotten to the point that we feel like they're done yet. So
that's a good philosophy, not to rush the process and then have a product that you're not happy with. Why put those deadlines? They could actually work against you. I wanted to ask if there is any funny or weird way you guys have ever tested a cycling product. I don't know if the clay one is the top one because it sounds like a lot of fun.
That's probably, that's one of the interesting ones. So, we do a lot of testing with riding, and this is a do not try at home kind of thing. But we will ride on prototypes that are not safe to ride with.
Okay.
In order to test certain things. And so
yeah, you have to.
You do. And so I can say that I have had at least one handlebar break while I was about 30 minutes from home.
Oh no.
That was an interesting situation. And it's, I was fully aware that this could happen. It wasn't dangerous because I was, I knew what I was doing. And we've had the same thing with early seat posts. Sometimes you just have to ride with something, and you have to be as safe as you can, right? So you try to control the environment. You recognize that, if you've got a handlebar that, that might, that could break, don't go ride in traffic, right? You go somewhere where, if you fall over, it's not the end of the world. We tested some seat posts where we would literally go to like an area like a park or something where, there's grass nearby or something like that. And so we would ride on the grass and try to not only get bumps, but it'd be like, if something broke, it'd be okay because you'd fall on the grass. And so early on, we did that actually with some very early seatpost prototypes where we determined that it was a really good design, but it was extraordinarily dangerous because if it did fail, it was like a catastrophic failure. It was like nothing was left. So that was kind of a thing. It is interesting. products in general, we always have a safety aspect in mind, because, this is a bike. I mean, people are riding quite quickly and things will happen, right? I mean, people's bikes get used, they get tossed around, and, all the equipment on a bike is subject to getting some damage over time. So we do think about, if stuff gets damaged, how does it fail? Because it's inevitable that it's going to happen. There's always going to be a situation where something wears because something else is added. And it's not like anyone is intending to do this. Someone might clamp something to one of the parts of their bike and it wears slowly over time and they don't realize, and then it weakens the piece. So we often do think about, well, what does happen if something fails? What's the result of things? And if something catastrophic was to happen, and this is something you do with engineering all the time. People that are familiar with engineering recognize there's a process to go through. But with cycling, it's interesting because you do have to sort of think about, well, if there's going to be a crash, because something fails, what's the best way for that to happen? And I think if you ignore that, you're sort of ignoring some real inevitable thing. So it's a good idea to do that. And honestly, testing some of these things is a good idea to figure out what does happen in those situations, because often early prototypes are subject to sort of failing in ways that, you wouldn't expect to see a final thing fail in unless it was damaged in some way.
Yeah.
But sometimes it'd be good. We've had situations where that's been the case and we can see, oh, wow, okay, that failure is actually pretty safe relative to something else. And that's a good thing, because now we know that's what it's going to be like when someone rides if that happens. So,
okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. You guys are looking into all facets of the product, and it is a great product. Speaking of which, without giving away any secrets or giveaway secrets, do tell what excites you the most about the future of Redshift.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's probably the thing that's always excited me, but there's a bit of a different lens, I think, now. So we've always taken the approach that we make products, that truly solve real problems for real cyclists. And not, I mean, everybody's a real cyclist, but, it's sort of, I say that because it's not like we're only focused on one group. We're focused on all cyclists, really.
Yes.
And we really like to make products that are, like I said, they solve real problems. And so we're not really sitting here thinking about, how do we make a lighter wheel set or something like that. I think that creates advantages for some very small subset of riders, but it doesn't solve a real problem. The problem right now is wheels being too heavy is not an issue. That's just not a problem.
Yeah.
That I find to be very interesting. So I think we are focused more on encountering needs that we see in our riding and stuff that, we hear from other people about. And I think when we encounter a need like that, we want to have the freedom to explore solutions and see if there is a product solution that, can be created for that at the same time, not just solves that problem, but also enhances the experience. And so those are kind of the two qualities that are really important. And so I think the thing that excites me the most is we've gotten away with doing that. We've been able to follow the needs and not sort of chase this idea of like, oh, well, this is a good thing to do, for some business purpose or something. And so when I say that we're product driven, it's really not just saying that. I mean, we truly are. I mean, we're constantly sitting down and thinking about some, needs that we thought about in the past, ideas we had for solutions, something new that's come up, and so we really do, I think, enjoy the idea of having the freedom to try to make great products that solve real needs and, sort of add enhancement. And lately we've been doing stuff that's maybe a little bit more on the fun side. Not like the seatpost isn't fun, but it can be thought of maybe as more serious and more central to the bike. I think we are enjoying a little bit of doing stuff that is a little bit more, in the range of, and something that's sort of like, oh, wow, that's a really fun way of solving that problem. And kind of, our mousetrap, pedal adapters is a good example of that.
That
right?
is fun.
It's
yes.
not a product that is something that people need for races and things. It's more of something you use your bike for when you're not doing a race or whatever. And I mean, and I think
so much fun.
Yeah, and they're fun, that we did them in color. So I think that's actually the thing that's probably exciting me now is maybe we've realized that we can do things that are a little bit more fun like that, and they can be really well received. And so it gives us even more freedom to kind of explore stuff that isn't as serious a problem, where it's like, oh, this is a product that allows someone to ride the bike after they've had significant injuries. I mean, that's this very serious, wonderful thing. I think that we're sort of entering into a range where we're also doing more products that have a bit more of that, like, oh, isn't that a really like fun way of doing it? And that's a cool thing that I'm going to add. So frivolous is the wrong word. I mean, only useful. We only do useful things, but I think useful with maybe a significant bit more fun on it is something that's exciting for the future.
Yeah. Exciting. Now, I asked listeners to send in their Redshift questions. Shall we go over them?
Absolutely. I'm excited for that.
Okay. Does it make climbing feel weird?
Good question. And I'm assuming that we're talking about the stem. And the answer is no. It does not make climbing feel weird. I think that the first time someone climbs, where maybe they're on the hoods and they are climbing, they might feel that the front end feels different. The interesting effect is that, and this is very subjective. There are different ways to climb on the bike. But if when you climb, you're putting a lot of weight on the handlebar, that's not really the most efficient way to climb. And so the interesting thing is, and this happened to me, when I started using the stem, I changed the way I climbed because I was throwing my weight around quite a bit. And that's not very efficient, no matter what kind of stem or handlebar you've got. And so I actually quieted my climbing quite a bit. And I'm a much better climber now than I used to be. So, I'm not saying that this is a climbing training device, but that it doesn't make climbing weird because if you are climbing efficiently, you're not throwing weight around. Now, the other piece of that I would say is if you're, in a road race and you're doing this monstrous sprint at the end, and you happen to be sprinting, with your hands on the hoods or something, you might be moving the handlebar around if you're putting, your max wattage plus 200 into this thing. And I think that's something that you just sort of accept, that it's torsionally rigid, but you might move it around if you're throwing your weight around like that. I don't think in general the stem is used on bikes where someone is sort of doing that on a very regular basis. So if you're sprinting, I think you can also sprint in a relaxed way. That's very efficient. If you're in a group sprint in a road race, I think equipment choices, depending on kind of where it is, maybe this isn't the ideal thing. If say you're in a cyclocross race and you really did benefit from it, then it's maybe a little bit of a trade-off you might make, where that crazy sprint for the last 15 seconds, you need to know that you might be moving around a little bit more than you would otherwise.
Eric, you're too good. That was my next question. Can you sprint with it?
Yeah. So I think for most people, most people's definition of sprinting, you're not going to notice it. The other thing is that I know that for me, I prefer to sprint in the drops. I think that is a place where it does make a lot of sense for most people. And as you move your hands closer to the steerer tube, closer to the pivot point of the stem, you have less motion because it is a single pivot where the moment is what makes things move. So for a lot of people, the way they have it set up, if you grab the drops at the far back edges, you aren't getting nearly as much movement because the weight is further back. So in that kind of sprint, you might not feel anything different than normal.
Okay, good. Does it need maintenance, both seat post and stem?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I think that what we try to make stuff that really just kind of like set it up and forget about it. So people often ask the other question, well, do the elastomers wear out or do the springs wear out? Do I need to change them? The answer is no, you do not need to do that. We have people that have been riding stems since 2015. Wow. And that's going on 11 years now. Same elastomers, stem feels just the same as it always does. Part of the reason is that both the elastomers, the springs, and we have some elastomers in one of our seatpost versions, we don't compress them beyond the point at which they start to break down. So they just never get compressed beyond the point where they can always be reactive. And that's by design. So from a maintenance standpoint, in terms of like the mechanism, there really isn't anything you need to do. We do recommend that people are inspecting their equipment every so often because stuff happens. Like I was saying, this is a bicycle, right? It's going to hit the ground. It's going to be lying up against things. Stuff is going to happen to it. So you need to check things, and you need to make sure that you don't have any of the equipment on the bike. You don't see things that are cracking. You don't see things that look like they're the wrong color around stuff. Those are always things to then, take a minute and say, oh, is something going on? So I think the main maintenance is making sure that you feel like the equipment is all as it should be. That's number one. And then I'd say maybe with the seatpost, like every few years, you might put grease inside it. We have suspension grease inside that, make sure that if the spring were to be close to rubbing against something, that it would, not cause any problems. That's basically the only, kind of thing. I like, we don't necessarily recommend taking stuff apart and cleaning it. That's not really something you have to do. If you feel like the, performance has changed, that may be a step to do. I mean, we've had some riders that will go on a massive trip and maybe they're riding like by the ocean every single day. And they'll come back and they'll say, like I'm, there's something that doesn't feel as right. Maybe they'll take the stem stuff out, they'll clean it, it'll be back to normal. So I think sometimes cleaning things can be a good idea, but I really don't clean my stuff and it's no problem. So I don't think that almost everyone really needs to think about doing maintenance. Maybe someone that does like a trip around the world when they come back, it's worth looking at stuff, but that's, I think, a pretty extreme case.
Yeah. Last but not least, can I install it myself?
Yes. I mean, I think that's a big thing for us, is that we really don't like the idea of making components that someone can't deal with themselves. So there's nothing about our products that requires some extreme expertise in terms of fit or tools that you don't have. This is taking, hex bolts on and off. I mean, that's kind of how we do it. We do it. I mean, that's the tools that we have. Obviously, as engineers, we probably have a lot of other tools, but, like regular bike tool sets, you don't need extreme stuff to put this on. I always recommend people use torque wrenches on their bikes in general. So if people don't have a torque wrench, they're not that expensive. You should get one. It's a good idea. Torque recommendations from manufacturers, they're really serious. And if you over torque or under torque, you can set yourself up for problems. There's factors of safety, but when you think about like a, through axle or something, if you don't torque that properly, like it can actually loosen. So people should have torque wrenches, because 10 Newton meters is a lot more than you might think. And so having a wrench tells you, what it is. It's also important on certain products, and ours in particular, you don't want to over torque things because you can crush stuff, so you just want to be a little bit careful with that. But everyone can install this stuff themselves. There's nothing about our products where at face value, it's impossible to do. It's loosening existing stuff on the bike, putting things on. We've tried to create sort of a video series that kind of walks through one of us just changing the things. And it's like a whole video of us just doing exactly what you might do. And so, that being said, I think that there are plenty of people that feel more comfortable having a bike shop do it. And it's just very easy for a bike shop. So, all bike shops know how to do this kind of stuff. They can do it real quick. They can do it well. The one thing I do recommend, though, is if people have a bike shop install the stuff, bike shops notoriously do not read instructions because they've seen everything. So they know what they're doing. With our products, if they haven't installed them before, it's a good idea to read the instructions because of what we talked about earlier. There is a setup process that involves, how do you want the thing to feel? And so you need to actually talk to the shop about that. You don't want them to just tell you what it should be. So they should, they should read it. You should talk to them about it. You should test it. And then, understand how you might be able to change it yourself. But we have a big focus on people being able to do stuff themselves, and also easy enough that any shop can do it. And I think using your local bike shop is like such a great thing to do. But there are times when you can't do that, so we don't want to create a situation where someone has to wait for the shop to install stuff.
That's really good. So you have the option. You can do it yourself or take to the bike shop if you don't feel like doing it. So awesome. Well, Erik, thank you so much for coming back to Zone to Speak. It's always a pleasure.
It's so fantastic to talk about this stuff. I really do enjoy it. And these are great questions that are coming in. I think it's really fun to talk about all of the aspects of things. I don't get to talk about that stuff very often. So it's nice to, not just focus on the next engineering task, but also kind of big picture things. So this is so enjoyable to chat about it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad to have you on the platform to talk about it. I think it's so useful, to learn about products that are out there. And I don't think we hear enough or know enough. So it's my pleasure to have you here to talk about this.
Well, thanks again.
And that's all for today's episode. I want to thank the listeners for tuning in. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends.